Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Adult Bible Studies. I'm Wayne Williams, and it is, as always, my privilege to be with you. If you're a first time person joining us for these lessons, I thank you for your presence, and I hope that you'll find this a very meaningful time. Those of you who are returning, I'm not sure what to say. Thank you. That's what I need to say. Thank you for your patience and your love and your grace and for your prayers as we study together. We're continuing in our unit of lessons from the Cokesbury Adult Bible Study series. And this lesson is for Palm Sunday, and yet we're not really going to focus on the traditional Palm Sunday setting as we do the lesson today, but we're going to focus on Jesus and his time in Gethsemane. We're starting a new unit in this book of lessons, and the unit's overall theme is doubt and wisdom. And we're going to look at the combination of those two things, how doubt sometimes is the very essence of wisdom, in the sense that it brings us to stop and to think about things that maybe we take for granted, or maybe things that we accept or reject too quickly. But today we're looking at Jesus and his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane right before he's taken into custody. A lot's happened since last week's lesson. Last week's lesson, we saw Jesus confronted by the Pharisees and Sadducees multiple times. And we saw how he finally silenced them and made them go away and leave him alone. And in their minds, it was a time of resolving that there was no way they were ever going to out debate him. So they had to look at other means to overturn the things that he was doing. And there again, it kind of ties into this unit's lessons about doubt. They had doubts that they would not let go of, and they didn't have the wisdom to see beyond their doubts and to listen to what Jesus was saying. And not only listen, but to see how he acted out what he said. Well, we're moving on. Gethsemane. The disciples have gathered in that upper room. They've celebrated the Passover feast. Jesus has shared those words of Passover, the Passover celebration with them. They've joined together in the Lord's Prayer. They've had the final supper where Jesus gives to them the symbol of the Lord's Supper. This wine represents the blood that I'm going to give in sacrifice for you, and this bread represents my body, which is broken for you. At the time, we can see that the disciples really didn't get it. And yet, it's so wonderful what he says, and it leaves you and I in our generation with some wonderful ideas of what it means that God is with us and God is in us in the things that we do. So let's look through this passage for today. Jesus and his disciples have finished the meal. They've withdrawn for the evening. Actually, the primary intent was to go and rest. Matthew 26, verse 36. It says, Then Jesus went with his disciples to a place called Gethsemane. He said to the disciples, Stay here while I go and pray over there. That was not an unusual thing for Jesus to do, was it? He said he takes care of his disciples. He makes sure they have a safe place to be. He says, this is a good place. Rest here. Allow yourself to recoup and regenerate. And I'm going to go over here and pray. And it was not unusual for Jesus to draw aside from his disciples from time to time and to have those moments of personal prayer with his Father. And so they weren't bothered by this a whole lot. The next thing he did was he says he took Peter and the Zebedee's two sons, that's James and John, who began with him. And again, this was, he took Peter, James, and John with him as he withdrew, asked them to come a little further with him and to be there in that more intimate time with him. But he leaves them alone in a smaller group and continues on even to a more private place for his prayer time. But as he leaves them, he says this, I'm very sad. It's as if I'm dying. Those are such powerful words. Matthew's intent here is for us to see the human side of Jesus, all God, all man. And here Jesus is exhibiting the reality of being human and having feelings and emotions and having that sense of being able to be overwhelmed. You've probably been through some times when you felt similar to this. I wouldn't compare anything that you and I go through to what Jesus was going through here in this at this point in his life. But yet we can understand this because, and perhaps in my life, it's a little more focused because of my wife's recent death. And I went through this time of deep, dark sadness. I went through this time of feeling like I was dead, like my world had changed and everything was upside down. And I had to just pray, God, be with me. And those words of that poet who wrote about the footprints in the sand and how Jesus is sometimes carrying us. Jesus was carrying me through that time of grief. And you may have been through some similar times too. And in that time, you learned to surrender your will. You learned that there were things in this world and in this life you just simply have no control over. And you gave it to God. And you asked him to do what only he could do. And that's what Jesus is doing here. I'm very sad. It's as if I'm dying. Wow. Surely we can come to Jesus boldly and present it before his throne of grace any need that we have, because he understands. He's been through that. He's been touched by it. He says to Peter, James, and John, stay here and keep alert with me. Keep alert. Be sensitive to what's going on. You're the three who will be in the leadership before you know it. He didn't say that to them, but yet that's the implication here is, I've done all I can do to prepare you, and this is a special time, so stay alert. Stay alert. Then he went a short distance further and fell on his face and prayed. This is such a graphic picture of Jesus just being humanly, physically overwhelmed and just falling on his face. It was typical pattern of prayer was to fall down and put your head to the ground as you prayed. And certainly that was emphasized the depth and sincerity of shutting everything else out and humbling yourself before God. He fell on his face and prayed, my Father. No doubt about who he's praying to here, to God the Father. If it is possible, take this cup of suffering away from me. Father, if there's some other way, you in your great wisdom, you in your great understanding, you in your infinite knowledge, if there's some other way for my task to be completed without it having to go through the steps that I'm aware of probably will have to take place, then Lord, I pray that you'll take this cup of suffering away from me. He trusted God. He gave it to God. He quit fighting the fight. He quit trying to think about, well, if I were to grab my disciples up and we were to scoot off over here to another place, then Judas, when he comes, wouldn't be able to. No, he doesn't do any of that kind of stuff that us human beings might want to do at a time like that. But he stays firm, stands fast, and he gives it to God. My Father, if it's possible, take this cup of suffering away from me. However, not what I want, but what you want. Those words of the Lord's Prayer. Not my will, but thy will be done. Your will is the only absolute, positive, complete way for things to work out as they need to. He came back to his disciples and he found them sleeping. Oh, what a commentary against Peter, James, and John. In some ways, we could be so critical of them. And yet, when we look around at the church today and the church in years past, there was a book that I read not years ago called The Sleeping Giant, and it was talking about the church and how we were how that author was trying to stir us to action because we had such power and such influence and such ability to change things, and yet we were a sleeping giant, asleep at the wheel, not doing the things that needed to be done. We have no room to complain about Peter, James, and John being asleep, for we have done the same thing. We've gone to sleep on our watch sometimes too, haven't we? He said to Peter, couldn't you stay awake 1 hour with me? Just 1 hour. Jesus turns to you and I and he says, couldn't you stand by me for just a moment and taking some time out of your busy day and all the other important things that need to be done and just have been with me and allowed me to fellowship with you and direct you and empower you to do the things that I needed you to do. Stay alert and pray so that you won't give in to temptation. Stay awake, alert. Not for Jesus' sake. He didn't need them to stand guard. He didn't say, draw your sword and be at the ready. But he said, pray so that you won't be tempted. Pray for yourselves. Pray that you will have that insight and ability and that tenacity and that strength to be able to stand firm and do the things that needs to be done. He goes on and he says, the spirit is eager, but the flesh is weak. We wrestle with that in our Christian lives, don't we? This old flesh. We get just like the disciples. We have a busy, hard day and we're just tired and exhausted, and all we can think about is sleep. And we put other things to rest, assuming that tomorrow we can get those things taken care of too. Our intents are good. Our method is good in the sense that we realize we're not empowered at that moment to do the things we need to do, but yet we lose something when we lose that cutting edge of God calling us right then to action. We assume that there'll be a tomorrow. Those disciples that Jesus left sleeping assumed that tomorrow would be just another day. It was Passover and it was a festival time and it was a good time and people were joyous and happy. Certainly nothing bad could happen during such a time. So they dropped their guard. The spirit is eager. Peter said, Lord, I'll never desert you. I'll never turn against you. And yet we find that he denied him 3 times, didn't he? The spirit is eager, but the flesh is weak. A second time he went away and prayed, my Father, if it's not possible that this cup be taken away unless I drink it, then let it be what you want. Here is Jesus giving his resolve over to God. Lord, I know that I still have a choice. I had a choice. I could have taken my disciples and made a run for it, but I didn't. I chose to stand firm in the task that you've given me to do. And you seem to be affirming that that was the right thing to do and right on target. And if it's not possible, it's as it seems, if it's not possible for this cup to be taken away from me, then I surrender my will to your will. And I pray that everything will be done just as it needs to be done to fulfill the purpose of salvation for humankind. Again, he came and found them sleeping. Their eyes were heavy with sleep, but he left them again and went and prayed the same words for the 3rd time. There's something magic about that 3rd time. That's 3. It's whole. It's complete. Jesus returned and prayed a 3rd time for God's will to be done. He surrendered completely. And that concluded his prayer. 3rd time kind of says that was it. That was enough. The 3rd time. He came to his disciples and said to them, will you sleep and rest all night? Don't you ever get caught up. It says, look, the time has come for the human one to be betrayed into the hands of sinners. Get up. Let's go. Look, here comes my betrayer. One of the lesson writers talks about this word that's interpreted here into English as betrayer. It can also be deliverer. And when you change that word from betrayer to deliverer, you might see this story in a different context and in a different light. When you see betrayer, naturally you think of Judas and how he betrayed Jesus. But this is not about Judas. This is not about a person. This is not about someone who took things into their own hands and made a big mess of it. This is about God and his plan and his will. Jesus wasn't betrayed. He was delivered. As he said in that second prayer, Lord, if it's not possible, I understand if it's not possible, then your will be done. And God delivered him into the hands. Those human beings, so full of themselves, so sure they were righteous and righteously indignant to do all the things that they did to Jesus, including nailing him to that cross and putting him to death. So full of a lack of wisdom in the sense of spiritual things. So full of human wisdom. And yes, when we put him to death, then it'll be done. And yet it wasn't done, was it? It was just the beginning. God delivered Jesus into the hands of those people because that was the way the plan went. That was what needed to be done. Jesus needed to stand before that Sanhedrin one more time. He needed to stand before Pilate, a representative of the rest of the world. He needed to stand boldly and firmly and with the conviction that he was a person who represented God and God's love and grace for every man. And from the cross, he shared that. Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. We look at this story and we're saddened somewhat. The disciples didn't know what they were doing. The people didn't know what they were doing. The religious leaders didn't know what they're doing. It's so hard in our world to find true wisdom. True wisdom only comes from God the Father. And in this passage today, we see God the Father declaring his plan and following it through to the very end. Using human instruments, not manipulating them, not turning them into little robots and making them do anything, but simply because of his understanding of people and how they act and how they think and all the things they've done prior to this. He understood that this would be the only way to follow it through to its conclusion. Your will be done is the title of today's lesson. And the purpose is to learn to stay awake to Jesus' obedience to the cross. To learn to stay awake, that we are called to be obedient to. We are called to seek God's will. And in those times when our humanity shows and our emotions overwhelm us and our physical strength fails us, we have nowhere else to go. And yet we have God to go to. And we don't need anywhere else to go. For in his will, he loves us and cares for us and does those things that help us to know we are loved. You're loved this week. Palm Sunday, Easter, what a wonderful holiday. I hope you have a wonderful holiday. I hope you use it as some family time and things like that. But I also hope that if you don't get so caught up in just the celebration, that you forget what it is we celebrate. In Jesus' name, amen.